So I think we should begin this session. Welcome to Humanities as Risk. I am Kathy Wallerstein, and I am the co-chair of the Critical Humanities Spaces network, along with Moritz, who will really be introducing the session. I am an independent director of humanities spaces and initiatives, mostly based in Paris. And I really just want to direct you to our webpage so that you can find out more. We only have an hour for this wonderful session, so I'm not going to say that much. But I will say just two words. Our group really is creates conversations around philosophical, aesthetic, and political questions around humanities spaces and what it means to create a space, what it means, what the space is, what lives the spaces take on themselves, and what spaces the humanities themselves, as the work that the humanities does brings to us. But we have a longer description on our webpage, as well as descriptions and recordings of all of our previous sessions. We've been around since 2021, but this is our sixth conversation. And we have another one in the fall that will be described there. So I just encourage you to find out a little bit more about our group and sign up for our mailing list. And to get to our webpage, you go onto the CHCI general page, and then you go to networks, and then we're the first network, and you just click on it. It's very easy. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Moritz. Thank you.
Okay, as Catherine said, we only have an hour for our session, so we'll be very brief. I'll quickly frame our question and then introduce our panelists, each of whom we've asked to present a short provocation in response to our prompt of 5 to 8 minutes. In the case of Jack, we said 7 minutes and 38 seconds, so if you want to time it. You can read the prompt in the program. We will collect the provocations, and then we'll take questions and begin a discussion. My opening statement is in honor of a South African writer, Paswan Mper, who passed away tragically young 20 years ago, and who taught me and us how to cast a wager. Our panel is on the wager of the humanities, on what we have called the humanities as risk. To frame this, I want to start with a quote from O.K. Matsepe, a South African writer who passed away in 1974. He writes in Sotho, I'll read the translation. A human being is a beast that when cornered throws away weapons and fights with the tongue. There's a lot to unpack in this line, which can be read as a hope for what the human might be. But I want to focus on what it might mean to throw away weapons so as to fight with the tongue. I was struck by Gill's formulation on danger yesterday. Endangered, therefore dangerous. Dangerous, therefore endangered. A loop. In the moment of danger, to throw away a weapon and fight with the tongue. Implicit here is that the tongue is perhaps a sharper weapon, that the work of articulation, of reaching out, touching, words touch, but so do tongues, of making meaning is perhaps more powerful, more consequential in relation to the moment of being cornered, being stuck in a loop, rewriting the world, as Fanon would suggest, one touch at a time. That's black skins, white masks. What makes the humanities dangerous? To phrase this differently, why are our students, our colleagues, whole nations in and of the South, driven away from what we might call an aesthetic education, from the humanities, left with no option, as Fanon also reminds us, but to pick up a weapon? Perhaps we can begin to come to an answer by considering what we all risk when we venture to do the humanities. What does it mean to risk the human? To risk being misunderstood? To wager that what might arrive in the wake of our act is something different, something with room for everyone, to cite Césaire? Or not? And because of this not, therefore, to be awake. As the anti-apartheid veteran Jeremy Cronin reminds us, perhaps art is to be defined in opposition to anesthesia. Art is the struggle to stay awake. The center as a site of wakefulness, as a framing in which we sharpen tongues. As Du Bois famously phrased it, reader, be assured this narrative is no fiction. But enough from me. We have 4 panelists who each bring different and complementary perspectives to this question of the humanities as risk. Our first panelist will be Jack Chen. He is the director of the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures at the University of Virginia and chair of the East Asian Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department. He has published widely, working on medieval literary texts, critical and literary theory, computational analysis systems, and reading and game labs at the IHGC. And if you want an interesting conversation, ask him about hedgehogs and cats. Kader Kunuk is the director of Academy in Exile and is professor of German literature at the Technical University Dortmund, an honorary professor at Australian National University connected with their Humanities Research Centre. Kader's research focuses on questions of identity, migration, and exile, and the literary and discursive formations that shape and are shaped by these. She is also a board member of the CHCI. Arto Quaison is Jean G. and Morris M. Doyle Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies and Professor by courtesy of Comparative Literature and Chair Professor of English and of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. Arto has extensively published, and when I say extensively, it's a little bit intimidating. Arto is very well published on questions surrounding post-colonial African literature, focusing on questions of tragedy, the social aesthetics, as well as forced movement migration, and also the Cambridge history of post-colonial literature, amongst just some of the things that he's written on. And our final panelist, Mario Teller, is professor of classics and comparative literature in the Department of Rhetoric here at UC Berkeley. I think I got that right, Mario? And chief.
Those are 3 different departments.
The primary department is rhetoric. And he's also the chief editor of the journal Classical Antiquity. Mario has published on the archive, tragedy, comedy, identity, and places the modern and antiquity into dialogue, reshaping ideas of affect, textuality, and materialities of the subject. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jack.
Thank you, is that all right? Is that around? Yeah. Thank you, Moritz. And I want to thank Catherine, the Critical Humanities Spaces Network. And I think that my talk today really is a personal reflection on some of the issues that I've been thinking about in terms of my role as director of the IHGC, the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures. But it does resonate, I think, with some of the things that were said yesterday and the day before. Jane, Fauna, Gil, Renee's talks, others. So I hope that these build out. So I've just finished my first year as director of the IHGC, and I understood my role from the beginning as one of reconvening a community that had lost the habit of being a community. I've learned that a good deal of my role is writing emails to my colleagues to invite them to events, creating spaces for graduate students, and supporting efforts to engage undergrads. I've always been an anxious host, worried that people will forget to show up if I don't remind them. Mrs. Dalloway was a formative text, like in my sort of college years, and I probably misread it completely, but that's how I understood what I was going to be when I grew up. And this may all sound, mundane, but this is what I think is the beating heart of the Humanities Center, the call for a community that would not otherwise take place. Invited speakers and guests need to be fed, of course, and in arranging dinners at the Institute, the thing I cherish most, and will never be part of my CV or my annual reports, but will go up to the finance office, is bringing together colleagues and students who might not otherwise have reason to break bread. Invariably, I will end up with an odd number of dinner guests, and it is on these occasions that I, half-jokingly, invoke the name of Elijah. Whoever shows up at the event and happens to be free for dinner may find herself in the seat of Elijah, the unexpected guest that we did not know we were awaiting. I've started to think about the place of Elijah as the principle of hosting, a way to keep open the door to unexpected possibility, which is, after all, what I think we seek through or in spite of our careful planning and programming. I know that the figure of Elijah is a complicated one. He is a figure who appears both in the Old Testament and the Quran. He is a wild zealot who rails against idolatry and calls down plague and drought to punish his own people. He is a prophet who is read typologically in relationship to the New Testament. He is the promise of future understanding within Talmudic tradition and witness to the ritual purity of the faithful. And he is the fifth cup and the open door at the Seder. It is this last version of Elijah that I'm invoking here, for this figuration of Elijah is the figuration of hospitality to the unknown guest, an open door that makes no demands and does not insist on the laws of the household. In many ways, I've been commenting and thinking about Derrida's writings on hospitality, which are elaborated across various works. Derrida reminds us that there's a contradiction in the very possibility of hospitality through a reading of Kant's Towards Perpetual Peace. There, Kant insists that hospitality is an obligation and a law, but, as Derrida points out, and, quote, the welcoming of the foreigner other as friend is always on condition that the host remain the proprietor, the master of the house, that he guard himself and guard and watch over what concerns him, and that he thus affirm the law of hospitality as a law of the house, oikonomia, law of his house, law of place. The gift of hospitality is therefore conditional and limited, and can neither be truly gift nor hospitality in any absolute sense. What would hospitality without the law be, without obligation, without the truth of authority? Derrida opposes an unconditional hospitality, pure hospitality, or hospitality of visitation, which he characterizes as letting the visitor come, the unexpected arrival, without asking for any account, without demanding his passport, and contrasts this to conditional or sovereign hospitality, which he calls here a hospitality of invitation. Pure hospitality is that hospitality at times we anxiously dream of and desire, one involving exposure to the one who or which comes. And it is this pure hospitality without which there is no concept of hospitality that involves risk. Or as he puts it, when someone arrives, when love arrives, one takes a risk, one is exposed. When someone arrives, one takes a risk. This is the foreigner and the refugee. But in the most general sense, this is the other who remains untranslated to the sovereign authority of the house, of the host, who claims the right to opacity, that's the guest, the one who arrives, who claims the right to opacity and irreducible particularity, who convenes not just the possibility of an alternative to the present state of affairs, but to all presence. This is the possibility of Elijah, for whom the extra cup of wine is set at the table, the possibility that Benjamin called the narrow gate through which the Messiah could enter, and what one might think of as the possibility of justice or democracy to come. Questions of hospitality and risk are at the heart of university responses to student protest and civil disobedience. Students may not be constituted as foreigners or refugees, though they may be foreigners or refugees. But when they take positions that dissent from the unacknowledged yet ever-present political, legal, and economic commitments of the university, they position themselves as other to the juridical hospitalities of the university, and this way take on risk of excommunication or, at my university, non-trespassing orders. And this is complicated by the fact that the university embodies one juridical structure, even as the university may not always acknowledge its claims to juridical authority. But the police, as state security apparatus, represents an entirely different sovereign structure. What happens when the university calls upon the police to enforce university policies? Who authorizes the police to measure out how much force to apply and to determine who has violated those policies? What is a student or any person when university regulations regarding time, place, and manner take priority over the rights to speech, public assembly, and physical integrity? Let me say that by police here, I mean both what Jacques Rancière calls the petty police, the officers of the law, which have license to act in suspension of the law that is being enforced, but also the broader category of the police in Rancière's sense of the term police, what he calls the order of bodies that defines the allocation of ways of doing, ways of being, and ways of saying, and sees that those bodies are assigned by name to a particular place and task. What he calls the order of the visible and the sayable, that sees that a particular activity is visible and another is not, that this speech is understood as discourse and another as noise. I'll end by saying that I believe in institutional structures. Derrida himself affirms that organized societies need to uphold their laws and therefore to regulate the practices of hospitality, and that pure hospitality is not realizable as such and perhaps should not be. However, the principle of hospitality, of visitation, is what should guide the hospitality of invitation, and it is the risk held by the other, the risk that we embrace, that makes possible community in the first place. To return to the figure of Elijah, Elizabeth Weber has suggested that Elijah stands for the question, for the insistence of the question that will not be brought to a close by any answer. And I would suggest that this is how we might also talk about humanities as risk. I beat my time by 2 seconds. Thank you.
Let me try to use the time as fast as possible, but I do have to respond spontaneously because it's really wonderful how you talked about hospitality. It reminds me, and I didn't want to talk about Erich Auerbach today, but Erich Auerbach opens Mimesis with the scene in which Odysseus comes home and Euryclea is the one who washes his feet in a gesture of hospitality, and it's all about the fear, the danger of coming home, and he doesn't want to be revealed, so I think that's beautiful. But I'm going to talk about more practical things, which is not being a professor of comparative literature or German studies at the moment, but directing Academy in Exile that we founded in 2017 as a response to what's going on in Turkey. In the meantime, we've expanded with many global calls. We are based now at the Technical University in Dortmund and are funded by the Mellon Foundation, Volkswagen Foundation, Open Society Foundations, which is now running out, or has just run out, and some other smaller foundations. We created this program particularly for colleagues in the humanities, social sciences, and law, and I see them interconnected. I can't just say the ones in the humanities without thinking about that interdisciplinary connection between at least these three different fields. And our program is for those who are at risk because of their academic work and or because of their civic engagement in human rights and democracy. And we're acutely aware that the language of human rights and democracy has now been co-opted by the far right. We can see that in Germany with the AfD, they're using our language of tolerance and democracy in a completely different way. Nonetheless, this is where we come from. We directed together, me and Vanessa Agnew are the co-directors. Egi van Uzbek is today here, one of the three coordinators who's been with us from the very beginning. And we have a cohort model, so we don't just individually take on scholars like other initiatives do, but we believe in bringing the cohorts together. So the last cohort that we had and are still hosting are the ones from Afghanistan. We started with Turkey, went global, and now we have a mainly Afghan cohort. We try to advance the kind of critical thinking that is vital for navigating a world increasingly characterized by intellectual stultification, by disinformation, by transnational repression, spread of xenophobic, racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic views. I want to also respond to the panel this morning where we talked about brain drain, and so often brain drain is put as something really negative. It sounds negative because it's associated with cherry picking and capitalizing on human flight. But I also want to remind us that what difference temporary or enduring sanctuaries have made in the past. For example, the foundation of the New School, the secularization of Turkish universities, the role that Arendt, Auerbach, and Said played in transforming our thinking in the humanities, and so on and so forth. So it's really important to remember what difference what we put in negative terms as brain drain has really made. And some of these intellectuals, exiled intellectuals, were able and are able to return to their home countries after a while. And this can be essential for rebuilding democratic structures. In the case of post-war Germany, that meant the denazification of institutions, including universities, the drafting of a new constitution, and the rebuilding of public institutions. In more recent times, exiled intellectual and political leaders were influential in building the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or helped bring justice after a genocide. So these are really crucial roles where also scholars in these fields play a central role. It's not up to us to decide whether a colleague should stay in an unsafe environment, turn into an inner emigrant, join the resistance, or leave. Let's look at the example of Ukraine. Some of them stayed and were seeking funding that would allow them to continue teaching, but we can attest today, and I'll show you the slides, that there's a new wave of scholars wanting to leave Ukraine right now. After the massive bombings of universities in Gaza, staying is not really an option. Working from there is not possible at all. They're cut off from the internet. The options that are there for Ukrainian scholars are non-existent for those in Gaza. We were able to create small programs for scholars, first for the ones from Turkey in 2017, and then after the global calls, then one specifically for Afghanistan in 2021. But I think that we need specific programs for crisis regions that need our urgent attention, and I don't think that we have any specific program for Gaza developed anywhere in the world. Let me know if there is one that is existent that we could collaborate with. But other than Gaza, regions like Sudan and Yemen equally need our attention. As much as it's crucial to assess the risk of an applicant safety, our emphasis is on the knowledge at risk. So although it's very difficult to do risk assessment, I'll talk briefly about it, but our emphasis is more on the knowledge. So we are, as much as the individual life, of course, is at stake, it's the knowledge that we need to that needs to be viable in exile. So when we choose from 258 applicants that we just received after our last call in April, we need to also decide, not only decide who's at risk at most, but also decide, is the knowledge that they will bring into the country, into Germany or Europe, going to be viable to survive after 2 years of the fellowship? Because our coordinators spend a lot of time coaching them, supporting them in connecting and rebuilding their careers in Europe. We pay attention to preserve gender equity among applicants. That's really a difficult thing to do. With the Afghanistan cohort call, we were able to convince Mellon Foundation and the Volkswagen Foundation. We're very grateful to also be able to host scholars without a PhD. And this enabled us to actually reach out and offer the program to Afghan women. Right now, we had this call with a PhD. We received applications from Afghanistan again, around 50 or something. You'll see in the slide, all of them are men. So we were right to talk to our funders and say, like, hey, we won't be able to rescue a single Afghan woman and provide her a possibility of continuing education if we insist on a PhD. So sometimes we just have to adjust our programs, talk to our funders, educate them, tell them what we have found out to change. So we are committed to preserving our gender equity. We take into consideration that women and certain ethnic or religious minorities have not had equal access to education and would not meet academic criteria if we generalized it. So it's not as if we can look at graduate student applications and can kind of assess them and put them on an equal plane. We partnership with a lot of colleagues sometimes. Wonderful Amy Lind is here, who's taken on one of our Afghan fellows and will host her at her institution. And so these connections here at the CHCI are really crucial, but also outside of the CHCI, we try to connect to colleagues in the field who will continue to support our fellows. Typical areas that are at risk, because I think, Kathy, you did ask about that specifically. So what comes to mind, what the scholars have been working on and are working on are peace studies, genocide studies, democracy. They are dissidents who have criticized authoritarian governments. They're advocates of Roma and Sinti. They are queer people, transgender studies. Specifically in 2018, there were many gender studies programs that were closed down in Hungary and Turkey, so we made an effort to bring them to, some of them to Germany and start a conversation. Risk assessment is unprecise, a burden for everyone's conscience. It's a form of triage that you have to exercise. And when the resources are scarce, 12 fellowships as opposed to 258 applications from 28 different countries, you have to kind of like go through a process of eliminating, which is really a burden for each one of us. We have to seek out those who are in immediate need, but also those who can be supported to be the best after these 2 years. There's a conflict between the principle of equity And the short amount of time that we have to preserve this knowledge in exile and make it possible for it to flourish either elsewhere or sometime even go home. And some of our Turkish scholars have gone home and are working under somewhat better conditions today. I think we should show you the slides because I'm aware of the time. Just see. This was our latest call for applications, April 15th. This is the spread of countries. The darkest one are the ones with the most applications. We received from the very light blue ones 1 or E2 applications, so you can see kind of the... But of course, somebody asked me, like, I think it was Sherry actually, from U of M, who asked me during the break, like, how do you get your call out? Who gets it? We send it to the CHCI, to networks like SAR and Scholar Rescue Fund and other places, but it reaches within a few weeks so many different countries, 28 different countries, 258 applications. These are all people with a PhD. And we've had these applications around the number of 150, 160 in previous years, with Afghanistan many more, 450. But with a PhD, the number is few. But our call for application is also very short, so people can respond very quickly because time is of essence. This is the gender distribution of the applicants, mostly male. As I said, from Afghanistan, this time completely male. These are the fields that are affected. So social sciences, humanities almost equal. Many of them in law, but we're most known in the circles of the humanities and social sciences. This is the distribution of the disciplines in which the applicants have graduated, and sometimes we have a hard time putting them into categories because they can be from country to country completely different. So it's nothing that we should repeat in public, but it's an effort to try to sort the applications. And since they just came in, we're just trying to understand, get our head around who these people are. And these are funders. Is my time up, or do I have a few minutes? My time is up. I'll save everything else for the discussion. Look forward to your questions.
Now, is it me next? Yes. Now, for my part, I want to talk about the value of complexity in the humanities. This is the least sexy topic one can imagine at this time, but you will see why I want to extol the value of complexity. Now, I come from a literature background, so many of my examples will be from literature. Now, there are two different types of complex texts. One is the primary texts themselves. So Sophocles, this is a random list. Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, or Shakespeare's Hamlet, or Toni Morrison's Beloved, or Samuel Beckett's Murphy, or Mrs. Dalloway. Just mentioned Mrs. Dalloway. But there's also the complexity of secondary texts, that is to say, texts. We label them theoretical texts, but I think the word theory undoes the complexity of critical texts that are actually trying to read the primary texts themselves. And so we have Hillis Miller, or Spivak, or Frantz Fanon, or Auerbach, has just been mentioned. These are all complex secondary texts. Now, what then is the value of complexity? It has many values, but one is the complex text, whether primary or secondary, places a requirement upon us to return to the scene of signification repeatedly. So the value of the text is that it requires us to return to the scene of signification or meaning making and to anticipate alternatives to the earlier propositions that we settled on. The best complex text, that's Oedipus Rex. You return to the scene of his tragedy, and anytime you return, you see a different angle or dimension to the tragedy. Toni Morrison's Beloved. Why did Sethi kill her daughter? Anytime you return to it, and the ethical conundrum represented by her killing her daughter is couched in such beautiful language that the beauty of the language itself is a form of complexification. So these are some of the values of complexity. But the other thing is that complexity in the humanities, and here I'm going out on a limb, must be seen as akin to complexity in economics. The economists will give you graphs and models of how the budget will be in 10 years' time, and we believe them, and they're often wrong. It's true, the third world has been victim of such economic models from the IMF, and most of them have been disastrous for third world countries. But they are models which are accepted, but they are accepted because of the levels of internal complexities that attempt to explain everything. The humanities also model the world, but we model the world through the anticipation of doubt, through the attention of detail, to the repeated embedding. So we embed what we do in literature. There's a constant embedding of a detail into larger forms. And so at issue is not the specificity of the icon or the image that is given to us. That's not actually what we are concerned with, but the complexity of the invitation to return to the scene of meaning-making in order to anticipate alterity. Alterity not being the position of another person. So alterity typically, the alterity is another person's position. No, the alterity is the anticipation of the doubt of the skeptical interlocutor, who is who ought to be integral to the schemas of one's own thought. So the skeptical interlocutor is not your mother or your father or your ex. It is a necessary addition of meaning making incorporated into the schemas of your own. This is what we find in Auerbach or Edward Said or Hillis Miller and so on. Now let me give you, since a literature buff, let me read a very brief passage from Things Fall Apart, which on the surface is the simplest possible text. On the surface, everyone knows what it means. And I like Things Fall Apart because every educated person ought to have read it. So if you haven't read it, your education is not complete. At any rate, the scene is of Okonkwo, as we know, the big warrior and so on, and his wife, Ekwefi. They have a daughter. And the daughter has been taken in the middle of the night by Chielo. Chielo is the spokesperson of the god of the hills and caves. And the Chielo takes the daughter in the middle of the night to deliver to the oracle. And Ekwefi decides to do something that it's anathema. She decides to track the woman who has come to take her daughter. It's her only daughter, and follows her. And Okonkwo, after a suitable length of time, follows them. So they follow, and they are going through. And the passage is really fascinating because of the nature of the spatial traversal, the fact that the pathway that they're going through throws up all kinds of uncanny scariness, which is, of course, the projections from Ekwefi's mind. So nothing is scary, but it's dark, and she sees very beautiful passage. At any rate, what I want to settle on is now they arrive in front of the mouth of the cave, and Chielo has taken her daughter into the cave. And Ekwefi is thinking, what will she do? What will she do? It's her only daughter, and this is what you see. As these things went through her mind, she did not realize how close they were to the mouth of the cave. And so when the priestess with Ezima, her daughter, on her back disappeared through a hole hardly big enough to pass a hen, Ekwefi broke into a run as though to stop them. As she stood gazing at the circular darkness which had swallowed them, tears gushed from her eyes. And she swore within her that if she heard Ezima cry, she would rush into the cave to defend her against all the gods of the world. She would die with her. She doesn't say, I'm going to defend my daughter against the gods of Umufia, my community, or against the Christian God. She says, all the gods of the world. Now, to unpack this simple, what appears to be a simple assertion of maternal care, we actually have to embed it sequentially in a series of dyadic arrangements that the novel gives us. The novel is structured around various dyads. But more importantly, the novel is also structured around different features of thinking, inferring, reckoning, coordinating cause and effect, and evaluating past and present. So we see that many times. For Ekwefi at this point, all these processes of inferring, thinking are abolished. The only thing that for her is necessary is that she's prepared to hurl her motherhood against the face of all the gods in the whole world. So all the gods. Now, the other thing that renders this really beautiful is that sometimes, and I'm trying to track these apparently mundane gestures, gestures of everyday life, but put forward against a scale of values that are counter to the person hurling themselves against and the scale of values could be the state, it could be the military. So Isabel Allende also has something like this. Of course, I've just mentioned Toni Morrison's Beloved. And it's the simple act of assertion of oneself against the domain of not being zero, the domain of negation. But it is a simple act also because, to all intents and purposes, and outside the context of the hurling of oneself, it is also a completely futile, it seems futile. How do you throw yourself against all the gods of the world? Anyway, I wanted to close by saying that even as simple a text as Things Fall Apart, and there are many, the fact that high school students are happy to misunderstand it is a good thing. No, it's a good, because misunderstanding is also part of the value of a potentially complex text. So the fact that high school students are keen to misunderstand it is a good thing. But the point is that the modeling of complexity is also the modeling of a particular type of reading which does not rest at the surface, but which seeks a repeated return to the scene of signification, to unpeel it like an onion which has no center. Thank you very much.
So I want to thank Catherine Wallerstein for inviting me to speak at this panel. So in the call for the panel, we are reminded that the humanities are constitutively at risk for their inclination toward critique, which some of us still believe is their raison d'etre. Critique, as Judy Butler reminds us, requires us to generate a response to crisis, that which demands a judgment, crisis in Greek, and an intervention. In the critical humanities, or humanities to cure, a risking of the unknown or the unthought, to use Sadiya Harman's term, goes along with a risking of the self, all of which the call places in dialogue with Benjamin's messianic time, but also, I would say, with the Derridean to come, l'avenir, split into the preposition a plus the infinitive venir. For me, as a classicist who has come to question the persistent positivistic foundations of the discipline, critical theory and experimental anachronisms have yielded a methodological refusal of the fantasy of unmediated access and of historicist monocontextualism as the closing of the gap in avenir, a refusal, in other words, of the reduction of interpretive infinity, something like the Levinasian face, to the finite, limited representation symbolized by the name. By the name, as opposed to the face, I mean the liberal or neoliberal methodological imperative of the useful and the safe, with all the securitarian association, and even a certain recrudescent empiricism brought about, not just in classics, by the reparative turn. In what follows, I want to think more specifically about the category of the useful, or rather the rhetoric of the useless. Neither quantitative nor empirical, the humanities we often hear these days are self-indulgent. They offer no remunerative career path, and worst of all, they encourage useless radicalism. Both of these charges are liable to be activated by the tent. Consider these two images. On one side, the student encampment on the Columbia campus. On the other, an installation of indigenous artist Rebecca Belmore, symbolizing migration, displacement, and alienation, which confronts the grandiose monumentality of the Parthenon and its infinite neoclassical descendants, including the facade of the Columbia Library. When the police attack the tents and charge students with criminal trespassing, they are implicitly rescuing them, along with their classmates, from the critique modeled and practiced by the humanities and cast as fundamentally useless and objectifying. Instead of pursuing a major or a PhD in the humanities, we hear parents and institutional voices say students should pursue business, engineering, etc. They should learn the rules and principles of capitalistic living, which will give them a job and a home, and therefore happiness. On this point, conservatives and liberals are fundamentally in agreement. There cannot or should not be a counter-imaginary to capitalism. Otherwise, the students will end up living in tents. The domicile of the homeless figures the possibility of dismantling Western architectural structures, their distribution of the sensible, their insurmountable givenness. The tent is an undoing of all the material and immaterial concepts troped by the home, the individual, the self, the biologically sexed body, and whiteness as the unmarked condition or the sine qua non of subjectivity. The community of the tents, their singular plurality, visualizes a de-individuation of the subject that is anathema for liberal thought that puts the individual at the center. The police's attack against the tent patently encompasses and visualizes the attack against gender studies, queer and trans theory, and critical race theory, the anti-normative apparatus of absurd, cockamamie, useless ideas taught in humanities departments that lead students to the life or the non-life of the loser, to an embrace of the tense, dangerous anarchitecture, to borrow Jack Halberstam's term. The wealthy American students who choose the tent over the building, transness over cisgenderism, are affected by a form of masochism, an anti-American self-loathing, as well as a sadistic pleasure in destruction that the tenured radicals in humanities departments perversely impart, an expression of the politics of grooming, which Butler analyzes in Who is Afraid of Gender. There is a projective dynamic behind this unreasoning, since the destruction of the tents, the shelters that become the prosthetic counterbodies of their inhabitants, together with the brutality directed against the students' actual bodies, allows the police to enjoy their own sadomasochistic jouissance. In place of the unmarked Lacanian barred subject, the tents, barred from campuses, literalize the figure of the barred object, to which, according to Calvin Warren, in the context of the murder of George Floyd, black bodies are typically assimilated by the police. I want to close by connecting the temporality of the split avenir with another symbolic valence of the tent. By protesting on behalf of Palestinians, the students become akin to those who have been forced to inhabit tent cities. In the imaginary of Israeli propaganda, not just the Palestinians themselves, but also the students are assimilated to animals. The reenactment of settler colonialism, visualized by the assault on the tents, also conjures the hunting of animals dragged out of their lairs. Animality is what is always late, what can never catch up with shifting standard of acceptability and recognition. The imputation of animality amounts to insistence that certain subjects or groups are not yet ready, or rather never will be, to move beyond marginality. Talking about late style, Edward Said says that, quote, where one would expect serenity and maturity, one instead finds a bristling, difficult, and unyielding, perhaps even inhuman, challenge, end quote. Elsewhere, Said says, quote, the cause of Palestine has remained for 2 decades the one unco-optable, undomesticated, and fierce national non-resignation, end quote. The animal, like the phantom of a Palestinian state, is the disavowed immanence, the all-too-real real that is always displaced as an abstract becoming. According to Sari Magdisi, quote, the idea of Palestine is the struggle for the articulation of a new sense of what it means to be human, end quote. That is a sense of the human that dismantles and exceeds the paradigm based in settler colonialism. When Palestinian lives are reduced to commodified zoe, when they become at once too concrete, just flesh, and too abstract, only notional life, they are, like those of animals themselves, subject to an inexhaustible deferral of animality in the etymological sense, which is to say, they are never quite endowed with anima, that is, soul. In a more radical frame than Magdisi's, struggling for the articulation of a new sense of what it means to be human could mean disrupting the conventional dichotomy of anima and animal, which strips anima from the animal, and it could mean locating the future in such a disruption which can build novel bonds and alliances. In a sense, the humanities cannot abandon the disruptive shelter of the tent, and they cannot cease to be, like the Palestinian cause, unco-optable, undomesticated. Thank you.
Thank you for those incredible provocations all round. I have pages of questions, but let me not abuse my function as chair and just hog the conversation for myself. So what we're going to do is open it up to the floor. I think what we'll try to do is collect maybe 3 questions if there are, and then ask the panelists to respond and see how we go. We have about 10 or 15 minutes, thereabouts, 10 minutes, I think. So there's one question.
Thank you for the series of very interesting, I don't know, is provocation the right term, but it was very thought-provoking, so yes. I have been thinking about the notion of critique and humanities, and each one of you have laid out different issues on the table. And at the risk of going back to to the UNESCO initiative that happened after 1945. One of the key questions that was actually preoccupying the people there with the limitations that they had to deal with, they were actually concerned with, now that science and technology brought us here, but then the human values have eroded, and here is where we find ourselves. So what I am also hearing from every one of you, I hear social relations changing, community and hospitality. I'm hearing the idea of the complexity, but also trying to excavate and be patient and try to look underneath the surface, which goes against populist narratives, which usually operate in binary oppositions. It goes also with the idea of trying to rescue the knowledge along with the human. And also because of the changing political conditions, and eventually what this brings us to, in different ways, also challenging the notions of humanities. But all that also connects back to the aesthetic and unaesthetic that the panel was opened with. So I just wanted to ask, should we also rethink what critique entails in such a setting where actually we see all these relations being reconfigured, and then the AI is another issue that was brought up earlier. And how can we rethink critique along those lines, considering that, as Kader also mentioned, a lot of the tools that we have developed have been hijacked and co-opted, beginning with Gramsci's hegemony, colonialism. Turkey's Erdogan now started calling himself as the wretched of the earth. I'm not sure he knows it's a line from the International. But I am actually curious about what you would have to say in relation to these changing conditions, and how you would actually rethink the role of critique along those lines, and how we can actually rescue it against all these odds. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for now? Do you guys want to respond to that question?
Thank you, Asle. Rethinking critique, I don't know if I can answer that in this response, but what do we do in response to what's happening is we've created these tandem teaching programs, because I think I said yesterday or the day before that we take teaching, the ability to teach, for granted. But the fellows who come to us are desperate to teach, again, into their countries. So we've created these tandem-taught courses online so they can teach into Turkey or Hungary, or we're now creating an arts and performance class that's created by the Afghan fellows, who are themselves photographers and artists. So they want to teach the Afghan girls and women in Afghanistan. So I think just the practical terms, rather than thinking about the big term, what is critique, like really practical terms, what do we do, how can we support to keep the knowledge even alive before we can think about that meta level? I think we don't have the time to think about the definition of this or that, because the people come with their trauma. They need to be supported by psychological services. They're coached by our coordinators, and they are desperate to get back to where they were And one of the ways of doing this is to teach, is to do exhibitions, to do conferences, to do colloquia, to help them understand how the American system works so they can do applications here in this country. So it's a very practical job rather than one where we sit around and think about critique. The fellows themselves sometimes come with these questions of post-colonial critique, bring it to Germany and try to apply it. They don't sometimes don't have the knowledge about the legacy of the Holocaust, but what it means in Germany. So there are many, many jobs that we do on the side to make that knowledge settle, find a new home within a European context. And what will come out of it, we have to wait for a few years. I mean, we've been doing this work for 6 years now, and maybe in 10 years we take stock, and then we can say, like, this is how it changed. But we can tell you that the nature of threat has changed. We used to get these applications by people who were banned from the profession, who has lost their passports, which is everything bad enough, or tear gassed in their classrooms. The applications now are much more severe. There are people, like in Gaza, 8 applications from Gaza. They're cut off from the internet. We don't know how they actually were able to write these applications. When we received the applications from Afghanistan, there were some of the women that we've accepted into our program, they wrote their applications on their mobile phones, trying to upload as much as possible of their work that they had done because their computers were already taken away and all they had was maybe a mobile phone. So how do you judge under these conditions? And then you have to trust that you've made the right choice, brought the right person, and we never thought we brought the wrong person. There are too many, I think, to make a wrong choice. But with those we came, it's a very practical job that one needs to do to rebuild those structures and help them to get back on their feet. So it is definitely something maybe in 10 years that we could, maybe when. Yes, of course, they are there because of of the authoritarian governments that they flee from. It's gender, it's usually colonial discourses, it's the traumatic collective pasts that they have addressed in their scholarship mostly. That's why they have to go into exile.
Yeah. I read somewhere, it was supposed to be lighthearted, that if you want to win an election as a politician, you must never use the word however. However, nevertheless, you can't do that. You have to be monochromatic. You know, you just say the thing and that's it. And it's actually true, especially in this country. They are not however people. However, I think the question also calls into view the difference between pragmatic solutions to immediate and life-threatening problems, such as what you are dealing with, which requires logistics. It requires funding, it requires an entire operational apparatus to get them to, and all these need to be taken account of, but not in order or so as to necessarily suspend critique. There's obviously a more pressing question. How do we get these scholars at risk to a safe place for them not to die? It's not even just for them not to do their work, to be able to, for them not to perish. But I think that the separation of, or to try and answer the question as a humanist, is that critique can never wait. There has to be a structure of simultaneity where the critique and the pragmatic problem solving has to somehow emanate together. Because if you suspend critique for too long, the problem morphs into something which seems impervious to critique. That is to say, if you suspend critique entirely in the name of solving a problem, a series of logistical problems, the problem seems to be impervious. It will become impervious to critique ultimately.
I appreciate that, but it's where I think, that has to be done anyway, but it's more how to practice hospitality. at a Western university that represents something completely different to somebody who comes from Kashmir or from Syria. And so how do we practice hospitality in ethical manner? So maybe go back to your...
Just really quickly, I think critique without love is cynicism, and critique with love is care. And that's how I would understand it, because it's a classroom setting, right? And that's what we're trying to teach our students to do, to care for the things that they read.
Mario, do you want to say something? We have 1 minute left of our session, so.
So I would just say that maybe I can tell this story. So I was watching a clip with Hillary Clinton on MSNBC, who said that the people who are protesting on campus don't know history because her husband's government offered Palestinians the opportunity to have their own state, and they said no. So I want to say that the fetishization of history and of the useful and of the empirical that unfortunately is invading the humanities can lead to statements like that. That is, history as a simple fact, history as pure factualism and not ideology. And that's where critique should intervene. And of course, her interlocutor on MSNBC responded, well, the protesters are indoctrinated by their communist professors. And this is a Biden supporter. And I'll leave it at that.